Come on, get up, get down with the sickness. You fucker, get up, get down with the sickness. Fucker, get up, come on, get down with the sickness. Open up your heat and let it flow into me. I can see the sickness is rising, and you see all that's good has died. Oh yeah, the world is a scary place. Come on, you know it died. Ba 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 ba. Get up, come on, get down with the sickness. You fucker, get up, come on, get down with the sickness. You fucker, get up, come on, get down with the sickness. Open up your hate and let it flow into me. Ba 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 now. Oh yes, it is a sick outfit. Thank you. I'm looking fresh to death. It's what I'm all about these days, looking fresh to death. And I'm doing it. I'm doing it my way. Oh right, yeah. I'm not on that. I'm out here. I'm out here trapping. So today we're going to be doing chapter 10 of The Dawn of Everything, which is a pretty important chapter. I'd say it's I think it's the longest so far, and it's definitely one where a lot of the strands of their arguments are starting to really come together into a coherent thesis that the more I read about it, honestly, the less importance it seems to have to me. Like, I find myself largely agreeing with what they're saying and agreeing with how what they're saying is a challenge to, an alternative to, really, the conventional narratives of human civilization. But the more I find it get to this point, the more I kind of also think at the same time, well, who cares? What difference does it make? The underlying premise here is that this new understanding of human history has a political valence. Like all of the sort of squinting and wish casting and creative interpretation of evidence that they do pretty explicitly on the service of a political agenda. And again, I don't have a problem with that. I admire the frankness of that, because obviously everybody is doing that all the time. It's just we're always supposed to pretend and lie about the fact that it's happening, and give them credit for being explicit with it. But the political valence of their argument to me seems totally, frankly, non-existent. If everything they say is true about how human civilizations evolve, I still don't know how it changes the price of butter, how it has any influence on the question of politics in the here and now. And I'll get into why, but just to start with, that's what I'm kind of getting with as I'm reading this. So just to summarize what's in the chapter, which is why the state has no origin. The humble beginnings of bureaucracy and politics. So this is where they're making a challenge to conventional evolutionary models for human civilization that say there's this thing called the state that has these features, and which evolves basically alongside the complexity of human social organization. People, as soon as you get a certain number of people, the old argument goes, a state will come into being to manage them. That is what they are in this chapter most that is the argument that they are trying to subvert and challenge. And the first way they do that is pointing out, this is a pretty kind of a no-brainer, really. Nobody can seem to agree on what the fuck a state is. There are a bunch of different understandings and explanations for what you have to have socially to have a state. And if that's the case, it makes you wonder, well, then what the hell even is this thing? If it has no stable definition. If the definition of it seems to be motivated by the underlying assumptions and preferences, again, the political element of the person studying them. So what they do is they bake down the state into three things that exist in all modern states, and that you might argue evolve at some point in human history, somewhere, but they're going to point out are not connected necessarily, which is what state formation theory previously had assumed. And they are sovereignty, that is, monopoly of violence over a territory, ability to determine who lives and dies, basically. In modern Schmittian terms, deciding the state of exception. The other is, and that is associated with, like I said, a monopoly on violence and the infliction of violence. Only me or people that I explicitly authorize can carry out violence. That is an element of the state. And that is a monopoly and a hoarding of violence. The second one is administrative capability, which is essentially a monopoly and a hoarding on information. And the third is charismatic politics. That is the ability to get people to do things just because you're that awesome. You are able to demonstrate to them just how fucking awesome you are and how you deserve to be listened to and given things. And those three things are all to be found in like a mature state. And traditional models that they're once again challenging say these three things come into being not all at once, but in a sequence. And it's determined by once again complexity of administering a bunch of people. So in the traditional model of this, the one that comes first is always administration. It is you got once you get X number of people and they're doing Y amount of complex economic activity and creating surpluses, then you need to administer their actions, and that then becomes the thing that generates charismatic politics as people, justify or vie for positions within this administration, which of course is going to, be directing orders in one direction, and people are going to be situated along it. And how do they do that absent, formal mechanisms that haven't been developed yet, other than charismatic competitive politics? And that once you have this strata of power over seeing this administrative apparatus, boom, you've got sovereignty. Because now you have charismatic leaders with control of administrative apparatuses who can use those apparatuses to monopolize violence. This is not a fitted, by the way. It's got the classic thing in the back. I'm not one of those. I don't even know my fucking head size. I couldn't get a fitted. And so what GrabGrow argue is that is not some sort of fixed, natural, inexorable order. The Mesopotamian civilizations we've talked about that had these relatively egalitarian structures of distribution in the cities, right? Oh, fuck, I got this wrong. No, I'm sorry. What I'm describing is what happened in Mesoamerica, where you have this administration, and then you have the emergence on the periphery of charismatic politicians who then take it over and use it to avert sovereignty. The traditional definition is from administration to sovereignty, and then finally, a charismatic politics devised to ratify those two things together. But they're saying that Mesoamerica is another model, and that there's a model where you have charismatic, like, origin myths emerge from competition, and then sovereignty adhering to those individuals. And then those individuals using that sovereignty to order people essentially to create an administration. So the point is, there's no fixed way. There's a bunch of ways that these three things can come together, which means traditional notions of a conveyor belt of state formation are wrong. And then to make this point, they pull up three examples of civilizations that emerged early in human history, where one of these three elements of sovereignty are fixated upon, and structures are built to reinforce without the other two. And the first example is in Mesoamerica, where you have the Olmecs, who were the progenitor civilization in Mesoamerica before there were any Aztecs or any Inca or any Mayas, whose civilization, such that it has left its mark, is completely fixated on ritual competitive sport between aristocratic warriors. These ball game where you like hit a rubber ball with your hip and try to get it into a little hoop that was endemic among Mesoamerican civilizations, and that the Aztecs also played, but all of their residual physical culture is fixed on displaying scenes of this competition, and this is an embodiment of a social order. You wouldn't call it a state, but a social order organized around charismatic politics, but which doesn't really feature any evidence of a meaningful administrative capacity besides the ability to administrate the wars and the sports that basically blend together, or any real sovereignty extended beyond the territory of the ritual space. They call this a theater state, where the implication is that rather than being like a fixed structure, it is a temporary, perhaps seasonal coming together, where these games and sports are carried off, and then everybody kind of goes back and does their own thing. The implication here is that a lot of the stuff that we see in ancient like physical remainders, temple complexes and art, that points to people who are like, state-brained towards a world of like total domination and like permanent structures of control, could very well be a situation where the vast majority of people are either humoring to get along with, or actively participating as enthusiastic spectators to a temporary expression of like aristocratic contest between warriors, but one that does not actually generate a capacity for sovereignty or administration, that doesn't actually like rule over anybody, not permanently. So this is a statelet or whatever, where you see one of the three legs and not the other two. Another example, and this is the most interesting one. I'd never heard of this, and obviously, as you can imagine, and you'll figure out why in a second, this is very interesting to me. there's this complex in the Peruvian Andes called Chavin de Huantar. My handwriting is bad. Huantar, I believe, which is in its physical remainders, what we've found and looked at, that was built and left, is a society organized around tripping balls. The artwork and the structures that are left are these psychedelic depictions of forms not stabilized as they are in most ancient art, where you have, this is a tiger, this is a human, and this is an eagle, and they're in some sort of interaction with each other. Rather, human and animal shapes that went in and out of each other. If that feels familiar to anybody who's ever had a psychedelic experience, and that, like, their temple complexes, rather than being like a big open place for people to witness some ritual, are rather a network of labyrinthine tunnels and chambers that presumably people would be led through in small numbers, and in some cases only through narrow hallways or narrow passageways that could only allow one person. And that at the center of this one complex, there's this fucking, this carved and engraved stele, this pediment that presumably someone would, at the end of a psychedelic journey, come to and then bear witness to, and come out of that experience with some sort of knowledge that would then be, I mean, by definition, esoterically held by people who had been initiated into the process. So here we see a civilization organized around the hoarding of knowledge that is the basic premise of administrative capacity. But again, no charismatic politics. There's nothing indicating any individuals in any of this art, and no sovereignty of any kind extending beyond the immediate area where these rituals are carried out. And I honestly think that if we really want to say, how did we get stuck? How did civilization get where it is? Where we got stuck in this, instead of the shifting and protean movement of people that characterized early civilization. And I got to say, at the end of the day, I'm probably, as a neophyte, I'm relatively convinced at this point of the grab-grow idea of early human social order. Not as people on different levels of a continuum, but as a constantly shifting and pulsating ball until you get to a point where all these societies, they encounter one another, they are changed by their encounter, they create stability and homeostasis within a certain situation, they come into encounter with each again, they break up, but they're never nothing is ever fixed and structured, because more than anything, the fact that people can move, the fact that human numbers relative to the size of the planet and its resources are such that all real conflicts can be resolved by moving, by going somewhere else, and that the intoxicating malleability of society that grab-grow paint here can be maintained due to the malleability of the world, the literal environment we find ourselves in, because there is not the same, the stakes of resource conflict are different. But then we got stuck. They themselves describe it as being stuck, and you know, once you get to dominant states, then all of this stuff, in my opinion, goes out the window, which is a big reason that I kind of wonder what the political utility of this is, because, you know, it wipes it becomes a process of that human flow that characterized like the global human community is interrupted and reversed, and eventually, and it's a one-way ratchet of those rationalized and dominated spaces being rationalized and dominated. And where does it start? I think it starts in those esoteric rituals that certain adepts find themselves engaging with in these societies for the necessary task of providing a religious narrative for the society, which is inherent and necessary. You want to talk about things that are not viable, that's one of them. Because to have a social order is to have a agreed upon, you can call it a narrative, you can call it a fantasy, you can call it ideology, whatever it is. And it is to one degree spiritual and another secular, no matter what. It is both of those things. And so there are always going to be people who are going to be better at telling stories. There are going to be people who are better at convincing a narrative. This goes back to the charisma thing. Like, yes, the warriors are able to conquer by virtue of their physical prowess, but that physical prowess is not necessarily go with an ability to narrate their actions. And it's the narrative of the actions that actually keeps things stuck together, that actually maintains social cohesion. It is not the acts, it is the remembering of the acts. And by definition, the people who are going to tell that narrative cannot be the people who actually did them. They're going to be people who observed. So I'm talking basically about the indoor kids, the nerds. They're always going to be there, and they're going to be fundamental to the maintenance of any social structure, as fundamental as the warrior class, and everyone will know that. And how do you keep telling these stories in a way that convinces everybody, including, and this is the important part, you? Because this is not a self-conscious thing at this point. There is no position of like radical skepticism of phenomena. I mean, yes, but it cannot be expressed. It cannot be validated because the social body is too overdetermining. It is extinguished by the continual, non-stop interaction towards the common goal of survival. So you're convincing everybody, including yourself. And one thing that helps with that, big time, is psychedelics. And maintaining your ability to narrate involves ritually encountering esoteric knowledge through the heightening of senses, which is what psychedelics at the end of the day do. This is, yes, people saying, oh, dualism. Yes, this is an imposed dualism. It is a lie agreed upon. And I would argue that the thing that allows you to dominate your fellow man is when enough of that group of people in a social order encounter the esoteric knowledge of non-dualism, the thing that can't persist socially because we need dualism to evaluate our environment and interact with it. Like on a moment-by-moment basis, we need to think in oppositions. So we won't encounter non-dualism except in specific moments of contemplation, reflection, like the Buddha sitting underneath the damn banyan tree. Or, if you're too busy for any of that, psychedelics. But psychedelics matched with a specific ritual. Because remember, when we're talking about this Chavin complex, it's not just blank walls, right? Like, these are images that have been agreed upon to be depicted, to lead you in a certain direction. And one of the things that can come from like the encounter with non-duality and then having your encounter with non-duality confirmed by others in an esoteric sect, one of the things you can, one of the realizations that can become to, especially I would argue in conditions of crisis, ecological or otherwise, conflict with other humans and changing ecological conditions, that the same lie that you all tell each other every day about there being some difference between you as a group and the world around you is going to have to be furthered by a new lie that there is some difference between us within the group. Because, and we will rationalize it in our temples, it's the only way that we will be able to get people to respond to the crisis that we see in time. Because these wonderful deliberative processes that Grave Girl loved to jack off about are inefficient, and they would agree with that. Yes, they're gloriously inefficient. They're wondrously inefficient. Yes, in times of fecundity, they are. They are a luxury that can be afforded under certain conditions. And when that luxury can no longer be afforded, the amount of time you give to getting consensus has to be constrained. And that means consensus has to be defined differently. Not everybody agreeing, but most people agreeing and the rest giving up one way or the other, out of some threat or browbeating. And then how? And then the greater the crisis, the more that decision-making power has to be abrogated. So he says efficiency is not valuable. Perfect. Yes, because value is the underlying premise of value is scarcity. And the societies that Grabgrow are jacking off to are ones where scarcity has been effectively abrogated. Not all the time, but out of the equations of like social life, written out of our decision-making matrix. Value comes into it when consensus can no longer be afforded. So this society, Chavin here, is the ball stripping culture, where you have a surplus redistribution effort that goes into the creation of a altar that creates esoteric rather than public knowledge. Like the Olmecs are doing huge public spectacle to overawe and impress their neighbors. Basically, like Grabgrow could argue, we don't think of it so much as to overpower them, but rather to, vent their need to be seen and to be valued and to be applauded. And then they get it off their chest, and then they can go back and to being like basically equal to everybody else outside of that time frame. Which is, that's the will to power that formulates that drives people towards a political life. The opposite is this Chauvin, where all of the public art is designed to move the elect, those who can perceive and re-express it, towards esoteric knowledge that is perhaps taken and then brought with one back to one's community. Essentially a sacred college for the shaman or wise men or narrators of the community. To come here, have this experience, and then go back with this knowledge. But like the way that the Olmecs, like what we're describing with the Olmecs is, that is essentially, that is the military arm of the state embodied. Like the fundamental psychology of the military. And then at Chauvin you have the psychology of the bureaucratic state extending to and defined by really more than anything the academy, right? The cathedral, if we're talking in mold buggy-in terms. This is where we actually structure our narrative for understanding the world, which gives the army guys a mission and motivation to fight, but which, and here's the important part, this administrative structure built around esoteric knowledge cannot be in charge of a real state. It needs a thing on top of it, and that is sovereignty embodied at a single point. That is the king. And here we come to the last civilization, the Natchez in the lower Mississippi Gulf Coast area in Louisiana, where all of the surplus of the social structure is brought to being in creating this great village where the Natchez son lives, the king, who has absolute sovereignty over everyone in his immediate vicinity. He can take any wife he wants. He can kill anyone he wants. He can take any objects from anyone. He can violate every rule that they had, every law, because the lawgiver must be above the law. The lawgiver cannot be constrained by the law, or else he's not the giver of it. You have to be beyond good and evil to define good and evil. And that is what the monarch, that's what the sovereign is for. But again, here, only sovereignty. Because outside of the great village, where he doesn't leave, nobody has to pay attention to the king. Nobody takes his orders if they don't want to follow them. And he has no administrative state to even tell anybody what to do. But you have this unlimited sovereignty in an individual, which of course is then attenuated by those other things. It's attenuated by having a military. It's attenuated by having a administrative capacity. But then in its person, it is able to basically hide and mystify the hand of the academy. Because the reason you can't have the academy ruling directly, the bureaucratic class ruling directly, is because while they might be totally unable to see the self-interest that motivates their actions because they're ideologized like the rest of us. They've enchanted. The important thing to understand here is they're not enchanting when they take power, when they redirect social structures away from communal life. They're not doing it cynically. They're not doing it, oh, I'm going to trick these fuckers. They're doing it because they have collectively come to a realization about what they think is necessary to survive, and then covered it with their faith in one another, their trust, which comes from having a definition apart from everyone else. That is, people who have the knowledge, people who know that this is all fake, that there is no world, that there's no distinctions here. But we're still bodies with feelings and emotions and desires and needs who would rather not experience suffering. So we have to work together as though we were different in order to reduce suffering. But that is a contradiction because now, once we're separate, fear takes over our relationship to the other. So this is all the stuff that goes into the subconscious transformation that occurs within the academic, shamanic, storytelling narrative class. But while their self-interest is invisible to them, it is nakedly clear to everybody else. If you are not in this class and you are part of a rapidly solidifying order of hierarchy that you're at the bottom of, and he's insisting to you that it's for the good and it's what God wants, him, stuck in his subjectivity, doesn't recognize the vast chasm in experience between sitting around the fire and eating berries and whatever the fuck, and being in the fields doing fucking agricultural labor. Being at one end of the spear or the other. So that becomes like an x-ray machine. It shows the self-interest and creates alienation. You can't have that. You need an embodied sovereign standing in front of this this bureaucratic consensus and mystifying it with his person, which stands outside of human interest, which is not the true of the administrators. So here we have three societies, each with a fixation around one of these three elements of sovereignty that doesn't contain any of the others. And I think the best way to explain that is, this is society in flux. This is society that is seasonally and geographically unbound. This is society where we might look back through history and see these physical structures that were left behind, and we might decide that they were the determining factors of the social order. But what was actually the case is that they were all temporary products of a temporary bringing together of people who might share a culture, share a language, but whose lives are largely spent responding to the cycles of nature. And these things we have, the Olmec ritual game palaces, and the Chavoian ball tripping palaces, and the Natchez great village of ultimate sovereignty and the great sun, is you have different ways for different groups within a social order, not by like rank or hierarchy, but just affinity, aesthetic affinity, like the Olmecs, the jocks, the Chauvins, the nerds, and the Natchez, the beautiful. Somebody with some physical, mental, inherited distinction from the people around them. That these remnants are these groups coming together, and the society in general creating a ritual to allow them to either facilitate their ability, the skills, facilitate the sharpening of the skills that they need in their communities. So like the Olmecs, they really fucking needed good warriors because it was a context of small states all fighting each other. In Chavin, it's you need the shaman. I don't know, maybe because of the ruggedness of the environment. Because rather than most civilizations that emerge in the lowlands, this one emerges in the treacherous Andes. And then in Natchez, you have this overpowering sovereignty, probably because when everybody got together, because of how far away they were, and how little they interact with each other, because of just how far they could wander in this incredible abundancy without hitting anybody else. When they get back together, they can't stop fighting one another. They don't have a common experience enough to avoid conflict. So you need a sovereign with sovereign power to, in that moment when everyone's together, keep everyone chilled out. This is all just me, imagining, but like that is the notion, is that in this flow of human civilization, this up and down, this steady state, a lava lamp of human social forms, what we're looking at when we look at archaeological evidence is just the sedimentary remnant of places where certain groups who spent most of their time in control of their own lives in all the ways that Graeber defined, like being able to make and change social relationships, be able to move away. There's one other one. Whatever. They're all there in abundance. And that what we have is not a permanent structure of dominance that emerges as soon as people come together, but rather the ornamental and the ornaments of the necessary structures that emerge in those moments of concentration to facilitate everybody living together and everybody living apart. And again, I find this a very persuasive description of the reality of social change before the emergence of the real mature state. And like part of the argument they make with this is they point out that there is this strong there is a strong bias against dark ages and interregnums in the historical record when people are looking back on it, because they don't leave all the pretty shit. It's only in the high, the apogee of like dynastic oppression and expansion that you see these golden ages of material culture. And when there isn't that, when you have like fewer remaining pieces of physical culture, like beautiful masks and pots and all this stuff, and you have less of that, and the stuff you do have is lower quality. It's more utilitarian, maybe because that surplus isn't being held in the cities and held in the temples, but is being used in the day-to-day by people, and that you have as complex a civilization. You have all the same structures of cooperation that you have in those periods of high dominance, but you don't have a physical record of them, and so they become just these periods of anarchy. And again, I find that very, very persuasive as an explanation of how we get these narratives and how they hide what really was going on. And so in trying to figure out how we get like more mature states out of this flow, we go back to Egypt, where Gradgro point out that the figure of the king and later the pharaoh in Egyptian society stands above humans, but does not display that charismatically. There is no culture of competition among humans in ancient Egyptian aristocracy. The pharaoh stood alone and unchallenged. The only real public rituals the pharaoh ever did were like a chariot race or chariot ride or something where they were the only person going. All those contests have been settled by the gods in the heavens. So there's no charismatic culture. But eventually you do see this really intense administration emerge around the king in the form of caring for him. Because this unchallenged god king requires a lot of care and feeding. He becomes basically a little baby, and that's why monarchy is like one of the only political structures that has kids involved in any way. Because a baby could be a king. Baby cannot be a ruler in any other social structure, and that's because that sovereignty is in the person itself. It's not justified by acts the way it would be in a charismatic politics. It's fixed to the person, and that means that the person has to essentially be treated like a god, and that means fed and bathed and pampered, and that means the employment of a bunch of people to do that, which requires surplus to be given first to them and then to the king. But then, like, the king can't die either, because if it's their body itself is imbued with godliness, then that has to persist beyond death. If it doesn't, then why are we doing any of this stuff? None of it will last. There's no reason to suborn ourselves to this, even ritually. The ritual has no hold unless the king is preserved beyond death, unless we wrap him up and hold him up and continue to feed and water him. And Gradbro here make an argument that the real thing that led to the bureaucratic regime of agriculture extraction in Egypt was getting food and drink, beer and bread to dead kings. Because for some reason, and it's amazing that Gradbro don't even stop to ask, hey, I wonder how this happened. it was decided by who? Who do you think decided this? That the food and drink that the dead kings consumed wasn't the same one that we mostly consumed. The living mostly consumed stuff that was accessible with relatively low effort, low labor input foodstuffs. They could make beer and they could make bread out of wheat, but that was a higher amount of calories inputted. That was a higher amount of labor required. So they mostly didn't, they used it as special occasion. But the king only drinks beer. The king only eats bread. So now to feed and water this dead guy, to keep him eating pizza and Budweiser, you create a permanent structure of agricultural surplus extraction. And again, it's amazing. They've laid out all of this, how this happens, and they don't stop. They just stop there and they say, oh no, see, that's what caused it. It wasn't the agriculture that created the state, it was the other way around. Like, once again, they're only making the narrow point that it was in flux. Well, how about we try to determine some direction here? Who the hell is deciding what the goddamn God King eats or drinks? It's not the God King, it's the priests. It's the priestly class. You don't think they recognize which types of food require what sort of social structures that then bequeath unto them administrative capacities and sovereign capacities? So what we have is this sovereign God King who is now adhering sovereignty is adhering even without like the warrior culture. He is able to assert authority through this regime of agriculture to feed him. Now, this is unstable and collapses, and maybe you can understand. You can see what the problem is here. The reason that the God King becomes immobile, basically, becomes not a warrior, not someone who has to challenge and prove his power in the real world, someone who is born with it, is that it disempowers the warrior class. You cannot claim power through force. Again, who does this serve? Who is in the driver's seat? Now, somebody's saying, oh, he's blaming it on the Jews. See, the Jews get blamed for this because of their position in Europe and the fact that they were not allowed to engage in largely engage in like the culture, the agricultural value structure of Europe, and were forced to adhere to those middle strata. I mean, they got into the bourgeois, basically, because there was nowhere else to go. They were forced into it. But that's just a fucking happenstance of history. This is just a class taking power over time. And that class being an administrative and bureaucratic class who is able to operate from remove from other structures of power, and therefore able to assert control of them. Now, what capitalism is when this class takes power and then creates technology that takes it away from them. Because I would argue that capitalism is inevitable unless something else changes. But I could argue no. Like, if we're talking about like this in fluid dynamic terms, capitalism is inevitable as soon as permanent regimes of state power become hegemonic. As soon as they can no longer be challenged by other structures. Because, one, they will always beat the other structures because of their advantages in efficiency. And two, they are inherently, like any other social structure, in conflict with like the lived environment. But the problem is that without any fluid social order to take the energy away, to like take the venting, take the refuse created by the contradictions within it, it will crash the entire structure. But the thing is, people are making decisions, right? And at some point, people are going, but they only make decisions by abstracting away responsibility and decision making to questions that can be answered empirically. What I mean is, technology is built as like a wedge to facilitate administration, overawing charismatic power and warrior power, military power, which is what the state is. Like if the state is these two things coming together, the modern state as we understand it, the one that can win against any other competitive, any other combination of these items, is one where real power has been concentrated in the bureaucratic and executive. But that requires a programming. It requires a cultural algorithm to power every interaction within it. Because these are people making decisions. And they know that there's no right answer. And so they have to, at the end of the day, flip a coin. And that is the ritual of power. And the answer to that riddle that the administrative state gives is a machine can flip a coin. And so we've had a coin flipping we've had a machine flipping the coin ever since. And because this state structure within within a closed ecological loop continues to destroy itself. And class conflict powers that destruction. Class conflict in conditions of a ecology that is still fluctuating, but it is now slapping against the whole of civilization rather than guiding it. And the only way that power can be held in that instance, in that phenomenon, is if it is personalized, is if we can wrench our spiritual conception of the self inward and away from anything else that we could recognize as human, the way that we did with the stuff that we could recognize as something deeper than the arbitrariness of humanity in earlier times. And this is a thing that is unidirectional, and that is a teleology, whether Graham Grow want to admit it or not. And that is, once you have that shift, once there's that eternal cultural hegemonic ideology that defines the self differently than it used to, there's no going back from that. There's only going a furthering of the process. And capitalism is merely the uncloaked technological exoskeleton of that cultural programming that all mature states are powered by. And over time, it only gets worse. Our definition of self becomes more inward looking. And technology is what asserts that. Technology is what makes that first physical separation, and then first in space, like suburbanization, and then in time, in terms of, yeah, you're not any farther away from each other than they used to be spatially, but you now have a cyber realm that you can spend time in that is not an engagement with any other person, but is merely a mirror reflection of the self. All our time spent online reflects the self and redefines the self as separate. And that is the technological arm of this this algorithm that is deeper, I would argue, than capitalism, and goes back farther. Capitalism is the social recognition of changing conditions, just as feudalism was, just as the slave empires were. Oh shit, things are bad now. How can we stay on top? And then reconfiguring based on what is allowed to maintain those two parameters. People in charge staying in charge, and adjusting to the new conditions created by the decline, the consumption of the world that cannot be redeemed fast enough. Okay. So they posit that mature pharaonic power in Egypt emerges because this baby king setup is unstable because things get worse. There's a drought. People are starving. The baby king can't do shit about it. And his bureaucracy can't do anything about it because it would mean them doing some work, which they don't want to do. So it collapses, but it does not collapse into anarchy and in a pejorative sense. It rather outbreaks in anarchy in a positive, Grave-Growian sense. And you go from the Old Kingdom to something that is referred to in the literature as the first intermediate period, a dark age before the second, the New Kingdom, or the regular kingdom, the middle kingdom emerges. But Grabgro says rather than some collapse into chaos that is then emerged out of sort of without anything having changed, rather the formal, like, the power of the kingly sovereign class is reaffirmed, because out of this collapse into petty principalities, you emerge a real charismatic, heroic politics, because people have to fight to live again. People have to fight to live in these declining conditions. And in so doing, some people are going to fight better. And by being able to fight better, they're going to and help others fight better and organize victory. And what victory means is plunder. And what plunder means is people eat. And that means this person now has a sovereignty invested in them by virtue of their actions, their heroic actions. And so the new pharaonic power that emerges has a base in that heroic era. But of course, then it grows decadent as it becomes embodied in an inviolable person over time. And then conditions get worse and the legitimacy is destroyed. And that's the cycle you get over and over again. And it's a cycle that we're in now. The only thing different between this end-stage crisis of the system we're in now and previous declines of empire is that there's nowhere else to go. We have run out of the flow in the globe because we've totalized capitalism, that is, totalized dominance predicated on resource extraction beyond what is sustainable, beyond self-sufficiency, piling up surplus to do violence with, that is, to waste it. And eventually it collapses because within itself it cannot reform. Now, the Marxist vision is that the specific technological reality of capitalism and how and what all of that previous cyclical action had created as a physical culture of objects and knowledge, i.e. technology, which was currently in the hands of the administrative sector of, like, Western rulers, but which could be taken by a working class that was increasingly living in the same conditions that had produced the bourgeois. And their increased numbers would be enough to have them take power. Because if it's bourgeois versus workers, and they have the same level of cultural sophistication, access to technology, and the same linguistic facility, all the same technological advantages that had let the bourgeois rule from a position of minority, if they had those same things plus the numbers, plus all of these newly enlightened workers who had been pulled from the ignorance of rural agricultural life, that had let this thing go on for so long, unchallenged from below, really, I mean, you'd have cyclical peasant uprisings, but they could never really overthrow power. They could only redistribute it a little bit. And then it would be reformed at the top. Because they're fucking peasants. They're farmers. They did not have the technological capacity to confront the bourgeois or the rulers before them, the feudal aristocrats, on their own terms. They needed to have access to the technology. And the Marxist vision is the working class would be able to do that. And they made a grab. They grabbed for the controls, but it was a failure. And now that means the terminal decline of an unchallengeable capitalist hegemony. Now, of course, that makes you think, oh no, that just means the cycle is going to continue. Well, maybe not if the world is completely destroyed, but I honestly don't think that's going to happen. I think that is what we want to happen, the same way we wanted there to be a nuclear war to end all civilization during the Cold War, because that's the happy ending, because we're not missing anything. At the end of the day, that's what it is. We don't want to miss anything. At least I know that's kind of what powers my fear of life, fear of death. And because we're addicted, like our egos are addicted to sense. They're addicted to pleasure of the senses. And that is, of course, why we are all in a constant state of suffering, because we can never have the actual pleasure. We can only seek a idealized version of it, a capital D desire that can never be fulfilled. And if the world is a smoking crater, then we didn't miss anything. That's why the ending of Don't Look Up was such a terrible, catastrophically bad idea, if they really wanted to scare people about global warming. Because the vision of total annihilation is a rapturous one. It's why Dr. Strangelove is a comedy. So that means, of course, there's going to be a lot of misery, horrible, beyond anything we can say. The slaughter to come, as Cameron Diaz said in The Counselor, will probably be beyond our imagining, because there is nothing crueler than a coward. But the earth will endure, probably. Even if there is a nuclear war as a part of like climate breakdown, which is totally possible, I still don't think that ends life on Earth. I mean, think of it this way. People say, oh, if we get the 6 degrees of warming, that's going to unlock the Arctic permafrost. We're going to turn to Venus, and that's the end. There will never be anything else on Earth. Or, before we get to 6 degrees, political strife on Earth leads to a nuclear war that, yeah, probably kills all or most humans, but also tamps down that move towards 6 degrees and refrosts that permafrost. Then so if that does happen, then the thing that can be optimistic about is that if this cycle continues, this thing of sentient beings coming into recognition of one another, that is civilization, comes back, that process begins, the wreckage of what we leave behind is going to be what they sift through to build it. And they will be different people than us because of that experience. And it's essentially the same. Like the sucker of optimism comes from faith in that which cannot be seen, because everything we see around us, the structures of domination that run our lives, and the experience of living that we are compelled into, makes us feel like life is misery and that there's no point to it. But we're all still alive. And we all value things that go beyond that sick desire cycle. And we don't have a name for any of them, and they cannot be identified in the fossil record any more than the evidence of Grabgro's sort of egalitarian, autonomous lifestyles are left. And like the word love is an easy one. to use to define this stuff. It's sappy, but it's real. That's what art is. Art is the remnant of that which cannot be formalized, cannot be seen. Because what it is it is a feeling below the ability to replicate it, which is the same experience as seeing God. You can have the experience and it will leave an emotional residue. But that residue, as time goes away, as time moves in one direction, as entropy moves in one direction, our ability to put any words to it goes away. Our ability to communicate it in any meaningful way goes away, which is why esoteric knowledge of the kind that is hoarded by the shaman of the universe and helped bring about civilization as we know it can be generated generated and maintained. Because you get somebody in an altered state, put them through a ritual, and then in the immediate aftermath of that experience that can't be named, can only be felt, and is felt as this oneness, this peace, this serenity, this absolute, and this is the important part, absolute certainty, which is something that none of us can have in our moment-to-moment life, and certainly can never express in any sort of language. And I think depression, one of the big reasons that we're all depressed as a culture, is how few opportunities to have those feelings we have. And so that means all we have is our uncertainty. And uncertainty breeds fear and misery and desire and suffering and all that. But you can feel ultimate certainty. And of course, that's what religious fanatics and psychopaths go out and seek, and they destroy the world in seeking it. They never find it. If they found it, they wouldn't be doing that. But it's that seeking of it that powers their actions. And we're all seeking it in self-destructive ways because you can't seek it formally without violating our laws of reality, like our understanding of reality as monads, as unconnected beings bouncing off one another in a totally chaotic, random stew of matter. Like, yeah, you have no faith without doubt, but the certainty still lives underneath it as a memory, but not as something that can be expressed to others. The closest we have are the symbols of religion and mythology, or an attempt to evoke in us the memory of the feeling. And the more successful they are at doing that, the more effective they are as cultural technology. But in a class society, we have these symbols that are meant to evoke these feelings, and to some extent they still do, but to put to the service of a system that alienates us and makes us miserable and pulls us away from that feeling of certainty. And it's that fundamental schizophrenia that defines life under capitalism, yes, but only because capitalism is the faster and more technologically advanced and more ecumenically experienced than previous ones. There are more people on Earth, and more of them are experiencing life that way. But it's a schizophrenia at the heart of power throughout history, and it's felt within the power those with power and those without, because these symbols are to evoke this feeling, and yet our lives are determined by structures that insist that feeling is a lie. That certainty of unity, is a lie. It's not sustainable. It can only sustain itself as long as surplus can be extracted to lubricate its creaky wheels, to keep the friction to a minimum. And as soon as the lube runs out, the thing starts falling apart. The Roman Empire was the first version of this that really dominated the geographic area that would be most amenable to technological innovations because of its competitive state framework. But this is why I ultimately don't really see why this book is supposed to be blowing everyone's mind politically. Because as I said, they are correct. There once was a churning sea of human social forms, moving in and out of existence with the tides, with the tides of history and with the randomness of event. But that flow is interrupted by a fixed regime of power, dominating first one geographical area and then extending outward. And then history is these things popping into being like tumors in a fucking liver and then growing like the malignancies that they are. It's a very fun book. I'm having a lot of fun with it, and I'm actually glad for all the cool information. Like, I really do, this has helped me think about history significantly. Like, this stuff about, like, you know, the global flow, that's really useful. But as a political thing, which they're trying to emphasize, I don't get it. They're saying you can live collectively with all of the cultural stuff, all the things we think of as necessary for a real, like, meaningful civilization. The things that make us reflect on our oneness, but allow us to enjoy our separateness. This is basically what he's hoping for, and what Marx was seeking to create on Earth, and what is the end point of all human civilizations, or the imagined end point, regardless of what they're actually creating. A situation where, yes, there is enough freedom to allow us to live not in fear of one another and enjoy the separateness of each other, enjoy our variance, enjoy the randomness that our temporary appearance gives us, but to recognize that we are not separate, but different faces of one another. That is to live without fear. That is to live without doubt. And Grabgrow are arguing that you can have that. Of course, not perfect. People are not going to feel that way all the time. There's miseries of life. Life is suffering and pain. But there's going to be a baseline that maintains a homeostasis that minimizes things like gender violence, warfare, ritual sacrifice, and class conflict born out of alienation, because there will not be that fundamental schizophrenic break between the symbols as we are to observe them, as they are propagated by those in power, and as it is, and what it is like to live under them. But once these tumors start popping up because of changing ecological conditions and people responding to them at different points, until somebody responds to them in a way that gives them a competitive advantage, because it reduces a degree of inefficiency that allows for decisions to be made quicker, for social alienation to be directed inward or directed outward and pointed at an enemy, as opposed to staying inward and undermining from the social body. And then it starts gobbling up all those egalitarian areas besides them. Like, they've described several times how in Mesopotamia you had this relatively egalitarian settled urban culture in Ur, and then on the peripheries of its trade network, these heroic kingdoms. People who basically were like, this stuff is gay. Like, I'm a big, strong guy. I don't want to have to listen to these people and do what they want to do. I want to go out and kill people. I got a lot of testosterone flowing, and if I fight, I know I'll win. Or at least I have a strong belief that I'll win. Unlike the fucking nerds in there who are like, no, I don't want to fight, I might die. And they go out on the periphery and they create these warrior cultures that under conditions of ecological flux allow force to be employed in a way that decapitates these egalitarian cities and takes them over from outside. And that does seem to be what happened in Mesopotamia. You have, like, they've talked about how, like, the council structure that they had before the king showed up persisted after the kings took over, and the day-to-day life of Urkians was not that much disrupted by having a king. But of course, over time that changed, and that power wrenched downward throughout the social order as stresses accumulated, as other empires emerged that copied them in order to fight with them. So they have a thing in here where they describe how bureaucracy actually emerged, not to facilitate domination, but to actually facilitate egalitarian distribution of resources. A little village in Syria where 6200 BC, a fire happened that fixed this community, this clay structures, and baked them. And we have, what do we got? What do we know? We got a little village, equal-sized houses, and a central storeroom, and a symbolic, a collection of like symbolic tokens used to keep track of distribution of resources. So this is, and no king, no power. So boom, we got bureaucracy to facilitate egalitarianism. Similarly, there's a system in Incan Peru, the Ailu system of distribution of resources in a community to make sure that everybody has land and that nobody gets too much power, too much money, where it's all debts that are accumulated over a period of time. The technology, like these knotted bits of string that were used to count and record keep, were all like loosened out at the end of the year in order to keep everybody square, which is sometimes associated with the Incan kings, but which preceded them and was then taken by those kings, just as in Mesopotamia. Those bureaucratic structures are now taken over to impose equality, as in we're all equal as we're all equally subject to the king, but with the demands that comes with being equalized as well. Like, look, the king demands X from everybody. You're all the same. But of course, everybody isn't the same. And what those systems, like the Aiul system, would do is recognize difference. Oh, this guy's got a broken leg. He can't bring me as much. He can't produce as much crops. You know, there's someone sick here. Okay, so we have to redistribute the labor, and we will redistribute it collectively so nobody feels like they've been forced to do anything. Now the king comes in and says, no, you all need to give us X because you're equal. Well, some people aren't going to be able to. And now we have the new class of slaves. We have the new peons. We have the new concubines. We have the people who can be subject to violence, who are written out of the contract because we've imposed equality through bureaucracy, but one designed to dominate. And it's like, once again, I think that's a very elegant structure that is persuasive to me as to how that happens. But again, it pretty much always happens in that direction. Over time, is that the warrior caste society that is able to create an aristocracy of physically powerful and militarily skilled warriors who work perhaps with a priestly class, but who overawe and dominate the priestly class. Because even the priests think that these guys are gods because of their power, because of how awesome they are, and what they've seen them do. What they've seen them do. They're going to be able to exercise violence much more effectively than your fucking little community garden co-ops. And then they decapitate you and they take over and eventually use all of your structures to their ends. So this is, we get to the end of the chapter. And they conclude, states emerge not out of inevitable processes of evolution, but through happenstance. and that play kingdoms become real, ritual structures that are meant to be temporary get elongated into permanence, but that civilization pre-exists states. And they end with a description of Minoan Crete, which very well might have had a theocratic form of government where like priestesses, female priestesses ruled over men, like the island in the Nick Cage version of Wicker Man. And they use this just to point out that even though you have all this physical evidence that, yeah, they had some sort of democratic like witches coven running over them, nobody in archaeology will call it that because they just have refused to believe it could exist. Well, imagine how much that the regime of discrimination, like refusal to take evidence at face value, the application of like a rigor that would never exist that they would never extend to anything that affirmed their beliefs. Imagine how that shapes all of our understanding of history. And it's like, yes, correct. Once again, I think they've made their argument very persuasively. And at this level, I'm ready to say it makes sense to me, so I'm going to believe it, because that's all I can end up going with. But again, my big takeaway is that they make no argument yet. There's one chapter in the conclusion left for like anarchism in the now and here and horizontalism in the now and here that that deals with my central problem, which is what we've shown pretty conclusively in this book is that the inefficiency, which is a virtue, the social virtue, if you want to keep something stable and long-lasting in isolation, that inefficiency of decision-making is a virtue. It allows you to have bureaucracy and it allows you to have warrior classes, and allows you to have sovereigns and without feeling like you're being exploited. It allows you to do that. But again, that's only in a stable state. The stable state is not possible in a condition where humans are coming into contact with each other and recognizing strangers and not friends, which is the definition of all interactions between humans once you get past a certain degree of human, of a certain level of human population. Not within a group, which is what they do a good job of undermining, but collectively, how many people there are on the earth. And eventually they start bouncing into each other and bumping into each other. And once they do, they're going to adapt to that reality where they can't go somewhere else and maintain their level of inefficiency of structures, where they have to stand. And if they have to stand, then they have to change their structures. And what's going to have to go is all of this glorious inefficiency, all these areas for consensus and response to the land and each other, recognition. It has to be hierarchicalized. Now, the Marxist teleological dream, the culmination of like the human experience that we're all yearning for, is for the regime of technological administration that we have developed that is absolutely capable of providing for everyone on Earth, not in equal conditions, but in conditions of minimal alienation. This is what I mean. Not equal conditions, and they would agree. Equality means nothing really if you don't have basic buy-in to the social structure you're part of. We could turn this. It might be too late now. I mean, it is too late now with what we have, but like during the 20th century, when there were still hinge points of real contingency in the battle between the working class and bourgeois that characterized the 20th century, if things had broken a little different, and here's another part of the thing that makes me optimistic fundamentally, in another world they did. In another version of Earth, they absolutely did. A version of Earth that is as real as ours. They did. That where the feelings and the blood and the sweat and the toil and the grandeur and the aesthetic heights and the all of the beautiful like marbled experiences that all the billions of people on this planet have been felt there too. that the working class directing this administrative alienated technological state could take that technology and put it to the work of creating a unequal, and the thing is, it wouldn't stay unequal, right? Like, it's not like, oh, you're telling me that all the people in Africa who live in like absolute poverty are going to just stay in absolute poverty but be happy about it now? No, because there will be a project of alleviating that poverty. Alleviating that poverty will be a collective goal accepted by every structure of human civilization and moved towards, which means surplus being moved from one part of the structure to another, from one geographic area to another. But those people in the middle not being dispossessed, not feeling like they're losing anything, because without the need to affirm hierarchy through surplus, but still, this is crucial, able to enjoy difference, but do it ritually. Enjoy difference ritually, and also in the performance of a heroic collective act of pulling people out of misery and poverty. And then once you get there, what's next? There's a reason that the Soviets set the fucking terms of competition between the United States and the Soviet Union on space exploration. We would never have gone to the moon without the Soviets. We might be going there now, but only as a last gasp effort to find value somewhere else and perpetuate human civilization as it becomes untenable on Earth. We went to the Soviets because the Soviets understood, like, once you've created a peaceful, once you have created a social order that allows everyone to work towards one goal, using the technology that the concentration of capitalism has allowed to be birthed into being, all that misery, all that human misery, created these things that can then be used. Now, that was the Marxist vision. I would argue that that's also the anarchist vision. Because, like, even when they say there's no authority, it's like, well, they still, what? It's a bunch of collectives, but those collectives make decisions, and they're making decisions with, by definition, this, like, increased technological capacity that is being used towards the social end of pacifying violence between people. So that means even your anarchist communal horizontalism would bring about this condition of a general level of minimal sustenance, safety, certainty of safety. You go to the fucking stars. You could literally go to the not conquer, but explore and touch and reflect on oneself throughout the galaxy. And we basically forced the Soviets basically forced the United States to create some sort of vision for interstellar travel. That, like, there's a reason that all those, like, America buffers like Tom Hanks fixate on the space program, because it was our best vision. But of course, in America, it was a crime to do that. Whitey's on the moon. To do that, to go to the moon when you have so much misery in your own country, makes that country look like a joke and sadism to everyone within it. Going to the moon, then, when there isn't anybody who feels that way, again, not that they might not be suffering. Of course, they're suffering. Everyone's suffering. But that they don't attribute their suffering to the state. They don't attribute their suffering to society. They're able to deal with it on its own terms because they are not alienated from it. Again, some people are. There's always misfits. There's always outcasts. There's always people who can't function. But instead of now, where the misfits and outcasts are people who literally want to feel, it'll be people who, like, were traumatized individually and, like, were the product of legacies of trauma that are still going to echo into the future, even if we ever got to that level of social sophistication. And they could be dealt with on that level. That is the horizon of, like, prison abolition, is that people who are misfits can be identified as such and brought back in. And those who can't be reconciled are such a small, fat percentage of the population that you don't need permanent structures of domination to keep them away or to scare people away from being them. So this is the universal horizon. It's the only horizon we can have. It's the horizon we're not going to get now without a collapse, and which we probably, as this could literally be a project of the squids in 100,000 years. Whoever does it, that is the Geist coming into full recognition of itself. And what it requires is the awareness and recognition that any structure of power that the liberatory collection of people, most of them by definition workers, but not all, could put together would by definition have to have structures of efficiency of action equal to the forces that they would come into conflict with. Because if they don't, they will be defeated. Which is why every great historical anarchist fable ends in destruction, be it anarchist Catalonia or Nestor Manco's Ukraine, they all get stomped. So that is why I think this is both a great book, but from the point of view of what the authors wanted, a failure. Because at the end of the day, they cannot really, as anarchists, really ground their analysis materially. Every time they try to, you can see them in the book doing this. They start resisting because, ew, icky materialism. You're going to start telling me that I'm not a free being? You're going to start telling me that my actions have been predetermined by material factors? Gross, icky, no thank you. Instead of moving through that, working through that liberal, frankly, juvenile objection, and then coming out the other end of it. Go through the fucking tunnel and come to the pillar and do not be afraid. But no, you got to run away from it. You're saying I'm not a free being? No materialism for me. So that means, like, when they're talking about, they're glorying in they're glorying in the inefficiency and the freedom of these structures. They never consider what allows that to persist materially. They just take it for granted. And what they do not recognize is that a social structure that can make decisions through administrative structures that depend on unquestioned hierarchy, as opposed to having to establish legitimacy anew every time an order is placed, can do things in a way that allows them to harness the technological weapons of society and then direct them towards the domination of others with all of the misery that it has caused internally, facilitating it by being directed outward. I mean, it's astounding. It's an astounding machine. And there's a reason that it won. There's a reason it took over. And there's a reason the only thing that could defeat it is a self-conscious state structure, not necessarily any of the states we have now, like the United States, LOL, no. But in terms of something that has all three of those things that he talked about. But where instead of being concentrated in a sovereign that is above us, a sovereign that is within us. And that can only be facilitated. That feeling of a sovereign that is within us and is us, but is also separate from us, that's only possible through humans going through a process of alienation from the world that becomes terminal, which is where we are now. We are terminally alienated from the world around us. We are terminally selfish. in a way that is not stable, the only next step, the only thing after that is either complete annihilation, as I said, possible but not inevitable, and not likely, honestly, or the final realization of that neurotic separateness, which is a re-fixation, a re-enlargement, a spiritual Big Bang that reinscribes us as part of a collective and that allows us to participate in hierarchical structures without being dominated by them. Able to utilize bureaucracy and administration and exploit separation of labor, at least temporarily, until the degree of technology is sufficient that the amount of labor doesn't have to really suck. Star Trek future. See, like under capitalism, this is one reason people can't imagine what socialism would really look like post-scarcity socialism. Because under capitalism, yeah, if you don't have anything to do, you go crazy. If you don't have a job that is productive in some way, it turns your brain into mush because you're not engaged in anything meaningful because you can't make meaning. And as an ideologized subject of capitalism, that's what you want. But in a post-scarcity communism, that idleness is where we work. And of course, that's something that probably will never happen. That's, once again, a fantasy horizon that keeps you on the treadmill. But what will exist is a place where the actual pain, the actual alienation of carrying out a divided labor, although labor division should be minimized as much as possible, where they have to exist, minimized in such a way that it's absorbable by the social fabric around it, which is not what we have now. Every alienation is shooted outward into misery that we feel that we then express to the people around us, and it dissolves the social fucking foundations from within. I mean, we're in the middle of that right now. We can see that all around us. And yet we're part of it, and then we're also seeing it and revolted by it. And the more we're revolted by it, the more we engage in it. It's a doom cycle. But like, for example, say there's no technology that's going to make it so that somebody doesn't have to go into the sewers and like fix something, or deal with shit, deal with gross stuff, have to do something like with your body that is painful or unpleasant. Somebody could do that job, but somebody could do that job for like 2 hours a week, as opposed to being compensated in money they can then use to buy things that come at the expense of others and that just drown the misery. And by expanding it, you can just do anything you want, which will be constructive by definition. It'll be constructive in one way or another. It'll be constitutive of social life, and therefore will be positive. And some of it is going to be fucking astrophysics, because people are still going to want to answer those questions, and they're still going to have the capacity to do it. And they're going to have more technological access than ever to try to pursue those questions. Everything that we do now that is productive, like meaningfully socially productive, will still be carried out because the desire to express that feeling of connection, love to each other is still going to exist. But some people are going to want to express that love by finding out if there's other species in the universe. Or if you can, see God. And if you've conquered matter, you can do that until everything possible that could happen has, and every version of redemption and rapture and revival that any human symbolic order has ever believed in can happen. So yeah, we're all going to rise again. We're all going to meet each other in the great by and by. And knowing that makes it a lot easier to deal with the real misery of living in the black iron prison that we are in. So yeah, I gotta say, yeah, GrabGrow, valiant effort, and I think they really do believe that they're dismantling Marxism in some way with this, or providing an alternative, non-Marxist, egalitarian social history to rival the Marxist one. But sorry, swing and a miss, because it cannot be materialist, it cannot be truly metaphysical. And it cannot really reckon with the alchemical transformation that goes on when a society breaks into classes and creates rituals around the perpetuation of them. And then it makes a new type of person. I've talked about this with this book before. And that you can't go back. You can only move through. And that means that you have to grapple with the institutional and technological consequences of those transformations. Well, I know anthropology has a non-Marxist class analysis, but it's academic. They want to make this into like a popular alternative to Marxism. Look how big it is. And they're talking about, apparently, like before he died, Graeber was talking to GrabGrow about Waingro. That would be funny if this was Graeber and Waingro, the guy from Heat. You about this, Kevin? It's GrabGrow. But they were going to do like a whole series with this. Like Debt, it was going to be like this and Debt, and like some other books. And they were trying to do like an alternative to Capital based on anthropology here. But while I think it does provide a real, moving, and plausible analysis of that, of what human society looked like before reaching a population threshold, and this is the important thing, GrabGrow are trying to take that on, explicitly say, no, it's not a function of population. And I think what they're doing with the book, and they're doing a good job of it, is saying, yes, not within population of a given group. But once you get enough people so that they're bumping into each other as strangers, it creates pressures on these forms that push them and extrude them in one direction. And that we've been living in the consequence of that ever since. Okay, so there we go. That's chapter 10. Next week, we're wrapping up here. This is the last formal chapter, is chapter 11. Ends on chapter 11. How many chapters does Debt have? Because if it's 11, that'd be pretty funny. On the historical foundations of the indigenous critique. Oh, I'm sorry, it's full circle. So we're going to go back to the indigenous critique of civilization that began the book and finish bricking up their monument to the ecstatic wonder of matriarchal consensus society. That has 12 chapters. Oh man, swing and a miss. And then there's a conclusion. I think I'll probably do the conclusion because, to wrap the whole thing up will be nice with its own episode. So 2 more of these, and then maybe like after that I'll do like a Q&A or something before we figure out the next book. If anyone has any suggestions, please let me know because I'm going to need another one after this. All right. Talk to you guys later. Bye.